We're in Matthew 16 this morning. Let's begin by reading verses 18 and following. Verses 18 and following. These are the words of Christ. He says, I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then charged he his disciples that they should tell no man that he was Jesus the Christ. Now it's worth noting, in the Bible, this is the first occurrence of the word church. If you were to look up the word church in an exhaustive concordance, this is the first time you'll find the word in the Bible. And so here it is in this context where Jesus promises, right, saying, I will build my church. Now, last Sunday, I looked at the previous verses where Jesus is asking his disciples questions about his identity. Who do people say I am? And people had all kinds of strange ideas. Some people thought Jesus was John the Baptist. Some people thought Jesus was an Old Testament prophet. Again, some kind of odd things. And again, people have all kinds of odd answers to that question today. Right? Who's Jesus? And, people have all kinds of crazy answers. But then Jesus asked his apostles, who do you say I am? And we find Peter's response in this context. Peter says to Jesus, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that launches into this conversation where Jesus begins to speak to Peter in verse 17, telling Peter he's blessed for this statement he made, this confession he made that Jesus is the Christ. So Jesus confirmed what Peter said. So again, if we not only believe Peter, but if we believe Jesus, again, who is Jesus? He's the Christ, the Son of the living God. So Jesus begins having this conversation with Peter and saying these things to Peter. And that's why we look at verse 18. He says, you're Peter, right? Thou art Peter. And upon this rock, I will build my church. Well, that brings up the question, what is this rock? What is the rock that Jesus has promised to build his church on? Now, there are folks in the world, in the religious world, who will say, well, this rock is Peter, right? The name Peter is kind of like the word rock. Peter means stone. And so Jesus is kind of making a play of words here. And so he's saying, well, I'm going to build my church on Peter, right? Peter's the rock. He's the foundation that the church is built on. And people will say this because they believe Peter's the first pope. And so it's through the establishment of the papacy, Peter and those who follow after him, who'd also be popes and that kind of organization of the church. That's the foundation of the church. That's kind of their argumentation. And they would look at this verse to prove that. Right? Peter's the first pope. Look here. Jesus says, you're Peter. Upon this rock I'll build my church. There you have it. Well, let's read this carefully. Is that what Jesus is saying? No, it's not. And not only can we know this from the context, but we can just know this from a brief study of the Bible. The specific term, pope, right? Again, I would challenge you. You can get an exhaustive Bible concordance. For those who might not know, maybe younger folks, that's just a book that lists every single word in the Bible. And you can open it up and look up a word just like you look up a word in a dictionary. And you can go to that book where every word's listed in the Bible. You can go to the P section and you'll never find the word pope. It's not a biblical word. Therefore, it's not a biblical office. There is no one ever in the history of the biblical record who's called the pope of the church. Well, where does the term pope come from? Well, if you do a little research, pope comes from Latin. The Latin word papa, right? And papa means just like what it sounds like. It means dad. It means father. Now, Jesus taught specifically, saying, call no man your father upon the earth, for one is your Father, which is in heaven. Now, is Jesus saying you can't go to your dad and say, hey dad, hey father, let's go for a walk or something? No, he's not saying that. If you look at this verse in its context, it's saying within a religious setting, you're not to call someone father as a religious title. That's the whole point here. And he mentions a few other things that we're not to say. We're not to call people rabbi, and a few other things he mentions. Again, this is specifically from Jesus. I didn't make this up. This isn't like a thing preachers in the Protestant movement or in the Church of Christ have made up. This is from Jesus' own lips. Right? And how many people today will go, hey, Father so-and-so, talking about your preacher, or whatever, priest, Father so-and-so. Well, again, Jesus said not to do this. And that's what the word pope means. It means father. It's just a variation of the word Father. So is Jesus saying in Matthew 16, I'm building my church on you, Peter, and you're going to be the pope of the church, and all those who are going to follow you, they're also going to be popes or fathers of the church? Absolutely not. That's a concept that is completely foreign to Scripture, and that idea of having someone like that wasn't developed until hundreds of years after the events of the New Testament. Now, so we can see that just from an examination of the Bible. But if you go back and you look at the words carefully, we can know just from the context and how things are worded, Jesus is not saying he's going to build his church on Peter. Now, let me just say briefly, in a lot of things there is a nugget of truth. Was Peter a very important person? Absolutely. Did Peter do some special things? Was he a special man, hold a special office in the church? Yes. He was an apostle. He also was an elder or bishop. That term is used of Peter if you read his letters. So again, he was a bishop in the church. He was an apostle in the church. But again, he's never called like the bishop over all the church or the pope over all the church or anything like that. He was an important man, of course, and I'm not downplaying that. Look at verse 18. He says, thou art Peter. Right? That's the King James. Thou art Peter. You are Peter, he says. Now, we would expect that if he's saying, I'm going to build my church on you, he'd say something like, you are Peter, and on you, this rock, I'm going to build the church. But notice that's not the language. He says, thou art Peter, and upon this rock. Now, Peter's not a this, right? He's a you. He's a he. You wouldn't say, you're this, and you're Peter, and on this I'm going to build my church. Again, that just doesn't make sense. This would mean something different than Peter. It indicates something other than Peter. The rock Jesus promised to build his church on is the confession that Peter made regarding the identity of Jesus. Jesus is the rock. Jesus is the foundation of the church. Again, if we back up to verse 15, Jesus asked his apostles, whom say ye that I am? Verse 16, Simon Peter answered and said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Right? This is the rock that Jesus promised to build his church on. His identity. Now, when we look at Scripture, several times, Jesus is called the rock. And again, the word rock here doesn't mean just like a rock. This is talking about an enormous bedrock foundation. Right? It talks about how they carved Jesus' tomb out of a new rock. That's the kind of rock. It's something you could carve a tomb into. It's huge. It's an enormous rock. This isn't talking about like a stone or just something you pick up. This is talking about like a bedrock foundation. And let's look at one example of this. Let's go to Matthew 7. Again, there are several times Jesus is referred to as the rock. Jesus is the foundation of the church. Matthew 7, we have a parable Jesus gave, or more of an illustration that he gave. Look at Matthew 7, verse 24. Matthew 7:24. Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man which built his house upon a rock. Right? So here's that kind of famous story we often use, I think, to teach kids, and there's a kid's song, right? The wise man built his house upon the rock. Right. This comes directly from Scripture. So you can think about the kind of rock you could build your house on. That's a big rock. That's a solid foundation. And here in this illustration, Jesus says, the person who hears my sayings and the person who's willing to do them, That man's building his house on a rock. Again, what does that rock represent? It represents Jesus' teachings. So it's what comes from Jesus. It's about faith in Jesus. That's the rock in this context. And again, he talks about that storm coming and the wind and the rain beating against that house, and that house was able to stand because it had that solid foundation. Verse 26, and everyone that heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them not shall be likened unto a foolish man which built his house upon the sand. So here's someone who's heard Jesus' sayings and says, well, I don't want to do that. I'm going to do something different. Right? And Jesus says, well, they're not building their house on the rock. They're building their house on something which is constantly shifting and unreliable. It's not going to give you a solid foundation. And the storms come and the wind and the rain beats against that house and it falls. Why? Because it's not built on the rock. So again, Jesus is the rock. Jesus is the foundation of the church. Again, as highly as we think of Peter being a godly man, being an apostle, he's not the foundation of the church. Jesus is that chief cornerstone of the church. So Jesus promised to build his church. If we trust in Jesus, then we ought to believe that we can be a part of his church. We can follow his teachings and be a part of what he promised to establish. And there's some folks, I think, who sadly have gone away from that. Their view of the church is only through the eyes of tradition and what men have established. They can't even conceive the idea that you can actually be a part of what Jesus promised to build. And even saying that to people, I've literally had people say to me, when I've said, the Church of Christ is not a denomination. We're not interested in practicing denominationalism. I've literally heard people say, look at this person talking about their church as if it's not a denomination. They can't even conceive the idea of a church existing that's not denominational, that has no basis in the teachings and traditions of men. That's the only way they can perceive the church. And sadly, they're enslaved to that idea. Jesus said, I will build my church. Do you believe that? I believe it. And again, I believe we can be a part of it. Just again, by being that wise individual, following his teachings. We can build our lives on that bedrock foundation of who Jesus is. He's the Christ, the Son of the living God.